White House press briefing room was a battlefield, and today the stakes were higher than ever. The air was thick with anticipation as journalists filled every available seat, their notepads stacked, their cameras blinking like electric fireflies. This wasn't just another routine briefing, this was an ambush. At least that's what they thought. The doors swung open, and in walked Karoline Leavitt, dressed in a crisp navy blazer, her every movement exuding confidence and control. She took her place at the podium, scanning the room with an unreadable expression. This was her domain, and she knew it better than anyone. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice steady and composed. "Let's get started." Immediately a hand shot up. Michael Grayson from the New York Times leaned forward, eager to set the tone. "Karoline, reports have surfaced that the administration is involved in a coordinated effort to discredit the press. Does the White House deny these allegations?" Karoline didn't blink. "Michael, I find it fascinating that the press calls it discrediting when we push back, but accountability when you do it." She let the words settle before continuing. "The real question is, does the media deny that they've been distorting facts for years?" A murmur rippled through the room. Grayson opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Sarah Caldwell from CNN cut in. "On immigration, the administration's mass deportation policies have been widely criticized. How do you justify these actions when so many families are being separated?" Karoline clasped her hands on the podium. "Sarah, I assume you lock your doors at night. Does that make you cruel, or does it mean you value security? The United States has borders, and enforcing them isn't cruelty, it's sovereignty." A quiet chuckle came from the back. The momentum was shifting. Then came Nathaniel Burke, an independent journalist. "Karoline, do you believe the press is treating this administration fairly?" For the first time, Karoline allowed herself a small smirk. "Nathaniel, the press isn't interested in fairness. They're interested in control." The silence that followed was deafening. In that moment, the reporters realized something. They had come to control the narrative, but Karoline Leavitt had just taken it from them. The fallout from Karoline Leavitt's press briefing was immediate and explosive. Within minutes of her commanding performance at the podium, newsrooms across the country shifted into overdrive. Reporters who had sat frozen in the briefing room, their narratives shattered by Karoline's sharp counterattacks, were now scrambling to regain control. At CNN, the tone was set. "Karoline Leavitt's dangerous rhetoric threatens press freedom," the host declared, shaking her head in feigned disappointment. She openly mocked journalists, dismissed valid concerns, and doubled down on a war against the truth. On the split screen, clips from the briefing replayed, each one carefully edited to portray her as aggressive, dismissive, authoritarian. Over at MSNBC, a panel discussion unfolded with urgency. "This isn't just about one press secretary," said Senator David Holloway, a longtime Democratic figure. "This is about a White House that is openly hostile to journalism, to transparency, to democracy itself." The panelists nodded in agreement. "If this continues," a columnist from the Washington Post warned, "we are looking at the most combative and dangerous administration in modern history." The attack wasn't just on television. Twitter was a war zone. The hashtag #FireKaroline began trending, with journalists, activists, and celebrities calling for her resignation. "A government that silences the press is a dictatorship in disguise," one viral tweet read, despite the irony that no journalist had actually been silenced, only challenged. But while the left mobilized to destroy her, the right rallied in her defense. Fox News ran a breaking segment titled, "Karoline Leavitt exposes the media's lies, and they can't handle it." The screen split between her best moments from the briefing and the furious reactions from mainstream networks. "They thought they could trap her," Jacob Myers, a conservative host, said with a smirk. "Instead, she flipped the script, and now they're melting down." On Twitter, Karoline Strong countered the backlash. "She just did what every Republican has wanted to do for years," one tweet read. "She called out the media's lies right to their faces." Senator Josh Hawley joined in. "If the press wants to act like activists, they should expect to be treated like activists." Karoline Leavitt just set a new standard. But as the media war escalated, A darker strategy emerged. Late that night, an anonymous source provided Politico with a so-called exclusive leak, claiming that Karoline had ties to fringe extremist groups. The article, vague on specifics but heavy on innuendo, suggested that her combative tone at the briefing was part of a larger, radical agenda. At the Washington Post, an editorial ran with the ominous title, "Karoline Leavitt and the Death of White House Transparency." The piece painted her as not just a press secretary, but as a direct threat to democratic institutions. "This administration isn't answering questions," the op-ed read. "It's dismantling the very foundation of accountability." Then came the personal attacks. A fake narrative began circulating online. Doctored screenshots, falsely attributed quotes, whispers of a scandal. The media wasn't just trying to challenge her, they were trying to erase her. The pressure mounted. That evening, Senator Holloway called for a congressional hearing to investigate the White House's aggressive and dangerous treatment of the press. The left smelled blood. They wanted Karoline in front of a Senate panel where they could interrogate her, where they could break her. Inside the West Wing, the tension was palpable. Karoline sat at the long conference table across from Mark Reynolds, the chief of staff, and Lisa Harrington, the communications director. The air was thick with urgency. Mark tossed a pile of printed headlines onto the table. "They're coming at you from all sides." Lisa exhaled, shaking her head. "They want a hearing. They want to force you into a corner." Karoline smirked. "Then let them." Mark raised an eyebrow. "You're not concerned?" She leaned forward. "Concerned? I want them to drag me in front of Congress, because the moment they do, they give me a national stage, and I won't be the one on trial." Lisa tilted her head. "You're thinking offense?" Karoline's expression hardened. "That's the only way to win." Mark nodded, a slow grin spreading across his face. "Then we go all in." Lisa tapped a pen against the table. "If we're doubling down, we need a strategy. What's our biggest advantage?" Karoline didn't hesitate. "The truth." Lisa nodded. "Exactly." "They twist words. We state facts. They spin narratives. We expose them. We highlight their hypocrisy, force them to answer for it." Mark glanced at the clock. "You've got another briefing tomorrow. Are you ready?" Karoline smirked. "I was born ready." The battle had just begun. The Senate hearing room was packed to capacity. This wasn't a standard oversight hearing. This was a public trial, and Karoline was the defendant. She sat at the witness table, calm, composed, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Clad in a sleek black blazer, she radiated confidence, unshaken by the hostile energy directed at her. Across from her sat Senator Evelyn Marshall, a veteran Democrat known for her relentless questioning. She adjusted her microphone, her expression grim. "This hearing will come to order," she announced, casting a glance at the cameras before turning to Karoline. "Ms. Leavitt, the White House's combative stance against the press has raised serious concerns about democracy itself. The administration's behavior is reckless, and we intend to get answers today." Karoline tilted her head, unimpressed. "Happy to be here, Senator." A murmur rippled through the audience. They had expected hesitation, maybe even defensiveness. Instead, she was ready for battle. Marshall's jaw tightened. "Let's begin with your recent comments at the press briefing. You accuse the media of spreading false narratives. Do you deny that your rhetoric undermines public trust in journalism?" Karoline leaned forward slightly. "I think journalism has done a pretty good job of undermining itself." The room tensed. Karoline continued, her voice sharp but measured. "Senator, do you remember when the New York Times ran a front-page piece pushing the Russia collusion hoax? Or when CNN treated the Steele dossier as fact? Or when the Washington Post insisted the Hunter Biden laptop was misinformation, only to admit later that it was real?" She let the silence stretch before adding, "You talk about trust, but what happens when the press lies, when they twist stories to fit their agenda, and when we call them out, suddenly it's an attack on democracy?" "No, Senator, the real threat to democracy is a media that refuses to be held accountable." A hush fell over the room. Marshall cleared her throat. "Let's move on." The next voice came from Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. her expression tight with frustration. "Ms. Leavitt," she began, her tone clipped, "the administration's immigration policies have been widely condemned. You've defended mass deportations, detention centers, and the refusal to grant asylum to vulnerable populations. Do you stand by these cruel policies?" Karoline didn't blink. "What I stand by, Congresswoman, is the rule of law." Omar leaned in. "Are you denying that these policies disproportionately harm marginalized communities?" Karoline exhaled, then turned slightly to address the entire panel. "Let me ask a question," she said. "Who here lives in a gated community?" A pause. Several senators exchanged glances. "Who here has armed security?" More silence. "Who here locks their doors at night?" The tension was palpable. Karoline smirked. "You see, you believe in borders. You just don't think the rest of the country deserves them." "This isn't about cruelty," Karoline continued. "It's about sovereignty. It's about protecting American citizens. If we're going to have an honest debate on immigration, let's do it. But don't stand behind walls while telling working-class Americans they don't deserve the same security." The hearing dragged on, with senators taking turns attacking Karoline, but each time she countered with sharp, precise responses. She wasn't just surviving, she was winning. Then came the moment of escalation. Senator Richard Blumenthal, a seasoned politician, leaned forward, his voice slow and deliberate. "Ms. Leavitt, we have evidence that a coordinated effort exists within the White House to manipulate the press, that you are part of a deliberate strategy to discredit journalists and control the flow of information. Would you like to respond?" Karoline took a breath, then smiled. "Senator," she said, "it's fascinating that you accuse me of controlling narratives when the media has been doing exactly that for years." She turned toward the cameras. "I wasn't supposed to win that briefing," she continued. "The press had a plan. They wanted a gotcha moment. They wanted me cornered. And when that didn't happen, they lashed out." Blumenthal shifted uncomfortably. "You call it manipulation," Karoline continued. "I call it pushing back." She gestured toward the journalists in the back. "They want to control the story. They want to shape reality. But yesterday, I reminded them, and the American people, that they don't own the truth." A shift moved through the room. The dynamic had changed. By the time the hearing ended, the headlines had already begun to shift. Breitbart headline, "Karoline Leavitt just took Congress to school." Fox News segment, "The moment Democrats lost the narrative." New York Times analysis, "Did Karoline Leavitt just redefine the role of a press secretary?" The media had thrown everything they had at her, but instead of being broken, Karoline Leavitt had become unstoppable. Inside the West Wing, the tension was thick. Karoline Leavitt sat at the long conference table, flanked by Chief of Staff Mark Reynolds and Communications Director Lisa Harrington. A stack of newspapers lay in front of them, the headlines blaring like warning sirens. The Washington Post, "Leavitt's War on the Press, How the White House is Silencing Journalism." CNN, "A Dangerous Precedent, the Most Hostile Press Secretary in Modern History." Mark tapped his fingers against the table. "They're not letting up." Lisa sighed. "They're pushing for a second hearing. They want the president to rein you in." Karoline smirked. "Not happening." Lisa nodded. "Agreed. If anything, this is working for us. The public sees through it. They're controlling the conversation, but so are we." Mark leaned forward. "The problem isn't just the media. We expected their backlash. It's what's happening behind the scenes that worries me." Karoline arched an eyebrow. "Meaning?" Mark pulled out his phone and slid it across the table. On the screen was a Politico article, an exclusive leak claiming that Karoline had ties to extremist groups. The story was light on facts but heavy on insinuation. Worse, it had already gone viral. Lisa's expression darkened. "They're not just attacking your words anymore. They're attacking you." Karoline picked up the phone, skimming the article. Classic playbook. If they can't beat me in the press room, they'll try to smear me personally. Lisa shook her head. This is bigger than just bad headlines. There's a coordinated effort happening here. False narratives, selective leaks. It's an orchestrated campaign. Mark's voice dropped. And we don't know who's behind it. Karoline exhaled. Find out. That night, Karoline's phone buzzed. An unknown number. She let it ring, expecting another journalist fishing for a statement. But when it went to voicemail, a notification popped up. She pressed play, a deep voice, calm and deliberate. You think this is a game? A pause. A breath. Back off, or it won't just be your career on the line. Karoline sat still, her grip tightening around her phone. A chill ran down her spine, but only for a moment. They were getting desperate, and that meant she was winning. She deleted the message. The next morning, another blow landed. A new article surfaced, this one even more personal, a fabricated scandal suggesting financial misconduct accompanied by doctored screenshots as proof. The left-wing media pounced on it. MSNBC host. If these reports are true, it raises serious ethical concerns about Leavitt's role in this administration. The Atlantic. Time to resign. Pressure mounts on Karoline Leavitt after explosive allegations. By noon, a Democratic-led committee announced a formal investigation into her conduct. The goal was obvious: force her out. Inside the White House, the war room was buzzing. Karoline stood at the head of the table, her team watching her closely. Mark paced. Lisa had her arms crossed. Mark finally spoke. This isn't just about getting you fired. They want to destroy you. Karoline exhaled. Then we hit back. Lisa raised an eyebrow. How? Karoline's eyes burned with determination. They're using leaks? We use facts. They're spreading lies? We expose them. They think they can intimidate me? She leaned forward. They have no idea who they're dealing with. Lisa nodded slowly. We fight fire with fire. Mark grinned. Good, because the president just called. He's not backing down either. Karoline smirked. Then let's make them regret this. That evening, a counteroffensive began. Conservative media exposed the fraudulent nature of the leaked allegations. Investigators traced the sources back to a political operative with ties to Senator Evelyn Marshall. Fox News breaking report: the smear campaign against Karoline Leavitt. Who's really behind it? Breitbart exclusive: Dems caught red-handed, how they tried to take down Karoline Leavitt. Then something unexpected happened. A whistleblower from inside a major news outlet contacted Karoline's team. The message was clear. They knew the leaks were fake, but they ran with them anyway. Karoline's team released the evidence in a brutal press statement exposing the coordinated smear campaign. It went viral within hours. By midnight, the Leavitt Vindicated hashtag trended worldwide. The media's narrative was crumbling. The Senate investigation, which was supposed to end Karoline's career, had just backfired. Spectacularly, she had survived. No, she had won. As Karoline left the West Wing late that night, her phone buzzed again, another unknown number. This time she answered. A familiar, deep voice. You should have listened. Karoline stared at the darkened screen. A threat. A warning. But she wasn't afraid. Because now she knew exactly who she was fighting. The smear campaign had collapsed under its own weight. The so-called investigation into her conduct had backfired, and her enemies had underestimated just how much support she had from the American people. What was meant to be her downfall had instead cemented her as a rising force in politics. Inside the White House, the mood had shifted. Mark Reynolds, chief of staff, smirked as he tossed the latest poll numbers onto the conference table. Take a look at this, he said. Karoline scanned the paper. Her approval rating had skyrocketed. Among conservatives, she was now one of the most popular figures in the administration. Even independents had taken notice. More importantly, whispers of a larger political future had started spreading. Lisa Harrington, the communications director, tapped her pen against the table. They tried to end your career, and instead they just made you a movement." Karoline exhaled, her mind racing. She had spent her career fighting to control narratives, exposing media bias, and defending the administration. But now something bigger was calling. That night, as she sat in her office, her phone buzzed with a message from an unexpected source, a senior political strategist known for shaping high-profile campaigns. "Karoline, we need to talk. There's an opportunity here you can't ignore." She stared at the screen. Was this it? Was this the next step? For the first time, she allowed herself to ask the question out loud. Was it time to stop defending an administration and start leading one? Karoline's journey is more than just a political battle. It's a reflection of something deeper. The fight for truth, the battle against media bias, the courage to stand firm when the world is against you.